I remember growing up being taught a very literal interpretation of what Genesis says in the Bible. There's 6 days of creation and then a seventh day of rest. And each of those days was 24 hours long, and God did a bunch of things, and the earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And you believe that, or you're a bad Christian. That's what I believed for a lot of my early childhood and life. And then you go into school, and they teach us about evolution. They teach us about these stars that are tens of millions of light years apart, meaning that they're at least tens of million years old, if not even older. And there's these rock layers and ice layers on Earth that show the millions and billions of years of the Earth's age. And I sat there with this feeling of like I either have to believe Christianity and ignore this modern thinking, or I be a good modern thinker and I ignore my faith. I was in this false dichotomy. I was trapped there feeling like these were the two options that I had. And that's how I kind of carried myself in a lot of middle school or high school. I would talk to people about faith and whatever, and people would always be like, well, what do you think about science? And I'd be like, I don't know what I believe about science. That's a huge question mark. And then I got to come to BGU and take Tom Shetler's critical thinking class. What a man and what a class. It was so good. We went over the four major views of creation, the four major theories, and it just opened my mind so much. I went in feeling trapped and isolated, and I left feeling kind of sharpened and enlightened by all this stuff. From Yada maps to class discussions to late night talks with my roommates about all the things we were learning, I loved every second of it. And so, what I want to do is encourage you guys to open up to what these different things might be. I feel like a lot of people were trapped in this, like, what does the scripture say? What do we believe? How do we defend this from science? And I feel like these views of creation really intermingle and show how God and science, they're not opposed to one another, yet God created science for a reason. They go together. And it's super interesting, and it really, I think, opens up a lot to us. And so let's dive right in with the four major views, starting with number one is the young earth view. And the young earth view is your literal interpretation. Each day is 24 hours long. Earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Ba-boom. And this view is believed for a long time, believed by most early church fathers throughout history. And so one of their major views, one of their major points is the word yom, is the Hebrew word for day, and it's the word used in Genesis. On the third day, blank. On the fifth day, blank. They use the word yom. And a lot of Hebrew scholars believe that yom can only mean a literal 24-hour day. So that would make sense to me. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so if they say that, that makes sense. And then there's also the words evening and day. This is like the second major point of the young earth view. Most of the days and there was evening and there was morning, the blank day. There was evening and morning, the fifth day. I mean, when you look outside, we have an evening and a morning, and we have a 24-hour day, meaning that they probably had a 24-hour day too, just kind of following. That's some more basic thinking, but that makes sense to me. I think one of the biggest points of, like, the biggest references for it comes from Exodus 20:11, where it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy." This is basically saying, hey, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. You do likewise. You work for 6 days and rest on the seventh day. That appears to be a pretty literal interpretation of what the scripture says. It's saying, God created it in 6 days, rested on the seventh, you do the same. That makes a lot of sense to me. So those are kind of the major points of the young earth view. That's kind of what makes it up. And then you look at the day age view. So the young earth view is kind of over here. The day age view says, hey, we believe extremely differently. We're over here. And it doesn't just throw scripture out the window or anything like that. It doesn't say, hey, ignore that heresy, believe this. It more opens it up. It says, hey, the Bible is very true, but there's also these scientific concepts that are coming out. How do those align? How do those look going together? And I actually think it's really interesting. It opens up a lot of layers to the argument. So one of the first things to look at is that Hebrew scholars who follow the day-age view don't have the same interpretation of Yom. From them, they say that a lot of times Yom can be used to mean different things. It's not always just one strict day. One instance of this comes in Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. So it says, in the day that the earth made the Lord and the heavens, that's probably talking about all of creation, which was obviously more than just one day, but it's already using Yom to describe all of these days. And that can mean a lot of different things. That opens up a whole new layer of the argument about what Yom can mean. I think it's really interesting. It kind of breaks that argument open to a lot of different discussions, a lot of different interpretations right off the bat. Second major argument for the day-age view is that on the sixth day, too much happened. And that makes sense. Adam named all the animals on the sixth day. And I actually wrote a satirical piece on this for class where this man, he was a small group leader and he had 8 boys in his small group. And he wanted to come up with fun nicknames for all of them. So what he does, I love these kids. God has entrusted these kids to me. I'm going to put effort into what I'm going to nickname them. And so he spends all this time, he spends about 2 hours coming up with nicknames for all 8 of these boys. And he's really happy with it, he's really satisfied, and he ends by really cheesily saying, wow, if I had dozens and hundreds of kids in my small group, this would have taken many, many weeks, if not months. Kind of as an allegory for what Adam did. Adam loved these animals, God entrusted them to him, and he was to name them. So of course he's going to put a lot of effort. I don't really see how he would name them in just one day. I think that's an interesting layer to the argument, and then it was fun to write a satirical piece on that. I think the single biggest argument for the day-age view comes in Psalm 94, where it says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night." And that's saying that 1,000 years for God is like a day to us, or 1,000 years for us can be like a day to God. It can go vice versa. So you look at those days of creation, those literal days, and they could have been thousands of years on earth and just like a day to God. And that's an interesting layer of the argument. I think that adds a lot there, straight from Scripture. So that's kind of what the day-age view is all about. It kind of takes Scripture, how can we intermingle this with a longer age for the earth? So you have the young earth views right here, day-age views right here. They kind of have opposite feelings. And then the restoration view is what we're going to look at next, and the literary framework view, which would be the fourth view, they kind of take interesting offshoots. So let's dive into the restoration view. And this is what I personally adhere to. It's very interesting. So it takes Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then it dives into Genesis 1:2, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. It takes those and says, hey, why are you guys arguing about how this fits into that? These are talking about two different things. These are billions of years apart. And when I read that, I was like, what? It's like the conspiracy theorist inside me, my mind just exploded. I was like, it just got really interesting. So following the restoration view, it kind of takes, hey, the beginning of Scripture, Genesis 1:1, that was when Satan and all the angels were created, and that's when Satan's fall happened. Because according to this view, in Genesis 3, when Satan tempted Eve and Adam, he was already fallen. So when did he fall? He fell in this gap. That's why it's sometimes also called the gap theory, between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And that's when Satan and God had their battle. And that battle lasted billions of years, showing that the earth, so simultaneously the earth is billions of years old, and then at the end of that battle, God re-begins. He goes, day 1, let there be light, and this literal 6 days begin. And I think that's such a beautiful intermingling of both points of view, and it also it's really beautiful. It's a beautiful interpretation of what God did. And so is there a ton of other scriptural evidence for it? Not necessarily. There's some things you can look at in Isaiah, and when you look at other Mesopotamian cultures, there's some parallels between their beliefs. But I just think it's an interesting way that it could have happened. And so I really like the restoration view, because I think it's a beautiful way of the ways that God can work and the ways that God brings Jesus to us. So then you look at that's kind of what the restoration view is. Then there's the fourth view, the literary framework view, which is the most conservative answer. It doesn't bring a lot of major this or that, it doesn't have any major offshoots or anything. It basically just says, hey, we don't know. You look at this interpretation, this is a Hebrew poem. It is not a scientific text. It is meant to appease the minds of Near Eastern peoples and Near Eastern cultures. And it's really interesting. It shows parallels between the Genesis account with the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation text, and some Ugaritic texts that were found in the 1920s. And there's a lot of parallels between them in the ways that they're written, showing that the Bible or creation happened in a certain way, and these are the ways that different religions kind of wrote about them. I just think it's really interesting. In the literary framework view, it really gets its strengths from the weakness of other views and also from its own flexibility, because it can fit in with a more literal interpretation or a more scientific interpretation of what Genesis is saying. It can kind of fit into either one. And so it's super interesting. I love all of this stuff, all 4 of these views. I would love to talk for days about it if anybody wants to call. It's so fun. But I think what's really important is to look at where Jesus is coming in. I think creation it's the beginning. It's where God created everything, and that's just the beginning of the story that eventually brought Jesus. God's greatest act of love was giving Jesus to us, and Jesus died, and then he rose again, and he's going to come back again. And creation is the start of this beautiful story of Jesus. And I think there's a lot of views of creation, a lot of different theological concepts, whether you're looking into soteriology or predestination. It's really important to look at the ways that Jesus was working in that. So what I challenge you to do is find other things, whether it's creation or whether it's any of these other theological concepts you're looking into. I really, really encourage you to find Jesus in that and let yourself fall in love with God all over again. Thank you.